Hello, my name is Marsha Morgan. I'm an associate professor of philosophy, and this academic year, I'm serving as program director for the Center for Ethics. I'm delighted to introduce our first guest speaker for this year's faculty reading group program, which will be accompanied by a series of guest presentations by invited scholars who are addressing dilemmas, questions, and potential solutions for how to engage in speech and action in the present socio-political moment. Our first guest presentation is from Assistant Professor Olúfẹ Táíwò, who is currently teaching at Georgetown University. He is a philosopher on the histories of activism and activist thinkers, the Black radical tradition, philosophy of language, contemporary social science, and the German transcendental philosophic tradition as well, in addition to the relationship between power and education. And he works also in the domain of public philosophy, one of the foremost reasons we have asked him to speak as part of our program this year. He is currently writing a book titled Reconsidering Reparations that considers a novel philosophical argument for reparations and explores links with environmental justice. Professor Táíwò has published extensively, including articles exploring the intersections of climate justice and colonialism. He has published in the popular presses, for example, in Dissent, Boston Review, New Republic, Al Jazeera, Slate, and The Conversation. Please join me in welcoming Professor Táíwò for this extremely provocative, generative, and trenchant analysis of how to engage speech and action today.
Happy to be here and in a position to share with you all. This talk is called Being in the Room Privilege, Elite Capture and Epistemic Deference. And hopefully in a second, it will make sense why it's called that. But if you've been in or around an institution of higher education for long enough, you might have heard someone say something like, as a person of color, or as a woman, for example, before going into a statement that had to do with their particular perspective as that kind of person. And the reason why, or the theory behind the reason why, is something called standpoint epistemology, which has long been a controversial idea in academia and some corners of the internet, but I think starts from a fairly innocuous starting point. So if you just stare at a textbook definition of standpoint epistemology, it's probably hard to see the controversy. The International Encyclopedia of Philosophy boils feminist standpoint epistemology down to three innocuous sounding contentions: that knowledge is socially situated, that marginalized people have some positional advantages in gaining some forms of knowledge, and that research programs ought to reflect these facts. Liam Kofi Bright, another philosopher who's at London School of Economics, has argued persuasively, to my mind, that these contentions just involve some basic empiricist commitments and a minimally plausible account of how the social world and our position in it affects what knowledge we get. If we get the knowledge that we need, the people that clean for a living know more about cleaners, for example, than people who don't. The people who drive a lot know more about roads. Similarly, the people who face specific kinds of oppression are likely to know more about those kinds of oppression than people who don't, for very obvious reasons that have to do with basic facts about how motivated reasoners get knowledge and what knowledge they choose to look and find. So if the problem isn't the basic idea, then what is it? Because as I told you, this idea is controversial. And as you may know from your own interactions, some people don't like that way of talking. I think that the problem that we should be concerned about is less about the core ideas and more about the prevailing norms that put them into practice. So I, cards on the table, actually think standpoint epistemology, as I've signaled already, makes all the sense in the world. I consider myself, on that team, if you will. Nevertheless, there is something that doesn't sit well with me, especially about calls that I hear in a lot of academic and activist circles to listen to the most affected, and center the most marginalized. In my experience, when people said those things, that they needed to listen to the most affected, they didn't mean to signal that they were going to set up Skype calls to refugee camps, that they were going to headquarter their new initiatives in local shelters and collaborations with houseless people. The conception of centering the most marginalized people that prevailed in those rooms, to me, in my mind, would require a different approach entirely to a world where 1.6 billion people live in slum conditions, where 100 million people are homeless, where a full third of the human population doesn't have reliable drinking water. It would require us getting up and leaving the room, as you might put it, literally in that kind of situation. So that's where the being in the room title comes from for this talk. So the basic problem that I'm setting out to describe and think about in this talk is this problem. It's not that standpoint epistemology affects how we manage conversations, especially in institutions of higher learning. It ought to. It's straightforwardly right. It's informative. It's a good way of thinking about things, I think. But the standpoints of putting that theoretical thought into practice call for practices of deference. They call for us to give offerings to people, for us to decide who to believe of the people we interact with in a certain way, for us to signal boost or pass the mic to certain sorts of people that we interact with. And these are good ideas in many cases, and the norms that ask us to be ready to do them come from an admirable place, come from admirable motivations. People genuinely wanting to increase the social power of marginalized people, to identify them as sources of knowledge, as rightful targets of intellectual inquiry and engagement, all of that makes sense. But deferring in this way as a sort of rule or default political orientation, I think can, in the long run, and perhaps even in the short run, work counter to marginalized groups' interests. I think it can lead to a problem that I've been calling elite capture, which is when a group's interests and the political projects around them and the social projects around them are hijacked by the most advantaged or best positioned members of that group. I think standpoint epistemology can be put to much better use than this. I call that alternative approach that I'm in favor of a constructive approach to standpoint epistemology, and I think it will have better results both from a political perspective and from an emotional and moral perspective. So I want to move to talking about what I think the basic problem is that's happening in these kind of deferential ways of responding to standpoint epistemology as a ruling idea or ethos or sort of moral position. And the problem has to do with a problem that you may be familiar with if you've taken social science courses, but the problem of selection, as statisticians might call it. And all I mean by that is to point out that many aspects of our system serve as filtering mechanisms. They determine which interactions happen at all and who participates in them. And that, we should recall, because it's going to be important later, determines what social patterns people are in a position to observe on the basis of a position in the social structure or on the basis of their personal experience, and also which social patterns they're in a position to directly affect or upset or whatever. So to provide an example, if you'll excuse me, given the topic, I'll speak from my standpoint. So as a Nigerian American person, I can clearly see in my own life and my own family history the effect of these selection pressures that come from social structure. For the majority of the 20th century, the US had a quota system of immigration, which made legal immigration with a path to citizenship almost exclusively available to European descended people or people from Europe, right? It was so draconian in this regard that Hitler regarded the United States as the world leader in developing explicitly racist policies of nationality and immigration. That changed in an important way in 1965 with the Immigration and Nationality Act during the global uprisings against colonialism and the national uprising against racism here. And that vastly opened up legal immigration policies, but with a preference for skilled labor. Now, as it also happens, the Nigerian American population is one of the country's most successful immigration populations, though of course no one mentions that the 100,000 or so of us are dwarfed in size by the 82 million Nigerians back home, as my parents would say, who live on less than $1 a day. And people don't tend to relate those facts together. But selection helps us do so. The selectivity of immigration law helps explain the rates of educational attainment of the Nigerian diaspora community. That community raised me, so that in turn helps explain the cultural resources that fueled my educational development, and it helped propel me through school, through higher education, and to the position that I have now at Georgetown University, which in turn helps explain why you and I are having this interaction we're having now, where I'm giving a talk to a university and I have the credentials to have been sought out to do this talk, and why you're in a position to listen. So it's easy then, I think, if we have this selection idea in mind, to see how the deferential way of putting standpoint epistemology into practice contributes to elite capture at scale. The very things that make me different from, for example, the 82 million Nigerians who live on less than $1 a day are the same things, the very things that explain why I'm able to talk to you in this sort of culturally important manner. The rooms of power, the rooms of influence that we interact in, they're at the end of causal chains. They're at the end of chains of decades long, right? The 1965 Immigration Act was before even my parents immigrated here, certainly before I was born, right? As we get to higher and higher forms of education, as we get higher and higher up any other form of power, any other domain of social activity, social experiences tend to narrow. Some students are pipelined to PhDs, other students are pipelined to prisons. And deferential ways of dealing with identity can inherit the distortions caused by these selection processes because they determine who's in a position to participate in them at all. If you are in a position in higher education where you find yourself deferring to people who say, as a Black person, for example, you'll be deferring to someone whose background is statistically disproportionately likely to look like mine than, say, it would be in a society where we had a more equal social standpoint, or sorry, equal social structure, equal social institutions, and where our interactions were more of a representative sample of the world that we live in. Our world is nothing like that. Our world is much more selective. So that's the sort of conceptual problem with deference. But I think dealing with it more honestly requires thinking about why it is that we defer. What is it that people get out of it? Why is it that it occurs to people to live out standpoint epistemology, which is a completely admirable set of commitments, in this way that brings along some problems with it? I think that we have to look at the very kinds of experiences I was just explaining, sorts of people that get pipelined to fancy rooms of higher education or policy making or media, newsrooms, the kinds of rooms that are very socially consequential. What goes on in them are socially consequential. How do those people get there, and what sorts of experiences they have? Those people who may subsequently take to speaking in this manner as a Black person, as a woman, as X, Y, or Z, probably didn't grow up experiencing themselves as the advantaged person in the rooms that they actually experienced. So a person who's privileged in an absolute sense, or perhaps from a global perspective, a person who, say, belongs to the half of the world that has secure access to basic needs like food, water, and shelter, may nevertheless find themselves actually rather consistently on the low end of the power dynamics that they actually experience, since they're likely to interact disproportionately with similarly positioned people. Again, I'll use myself as an example. I certainly astronomically, globally privileged and globally advantaged from a sort of absolute perspective. But I grew up in a middle-class community around other middle-class people. So what stood out to me in my personal experience was racial disadvantage rather than those kind of global forms of economic advantage that just as powerfully, perhaps more powerfully, shaped the kind of experiences that I had. The rooms that we're in, the social dynamics that we actually experience, have an outsized role in developing and refining our understanding of ourselves as political subjects, as members of a community. And standpoint epistemology gets off the ground by noticing this insight that where we're located has to do with what we know. And it notices the ways that it can enrich us as individuals and collectives, and it's entirely right to do so. But there's a problem here that interacts with the selection problem that I just explained. Our sense of ourselves and the patterns of deference that we tend to fit with our commitments to standpoint epistemology can easily foreground the senses which we're marginalized rather than the ways that we're not, especially when exposure to people below us in the relevant hierarchies is controlled or prevented. So the very strength of standpoint epistemology, its recognition of the importance of perspective, can become a weakness when combined with the wrong norms of living it out in actual action. From a structural perspective, the rooms that we never need to enter and the explanations of why those of us who are privileged never need to enter those rooms might have just as much or even more to teach us about the world and our place in it than our personal experiences in the rooms that we do enter. If so, then the deferential approach to standpoint epistemology is actually the very thing that prevents us from centering or even hearing from the most marginalized, because it focuses on the interactions of the rooms that we occupy, rather than forcing us to account for the interactions that we don't participate in or that we don't see. For reasons that are largely insensitive to our failures or successes in the rooms that we actually occupy. There's 26 million people in refugee camps that are not in the rooms where, not in the fancy rooms anyway, where this politics is wielded. And this eliminates some pressures that might otherwise trouble the centrality of our own suffering and marginalization. And also of those marginalized people that do happen to make it into rooms with us. I think it's these sorts of problems that explain why it is that people live out deference epistemology, as you might call it, in the way that they do. It's not that people are cynical, it's not that people are plotting, it's not that they're acting in bad faith. It's that this kind of way of dealing with standpoint epistemology and this kind of focus on our own marginalization matches the world as we've experienced it. And all of us have only experienced a narrow slice of the world, and that world that we've experienced is non-randomly related to our position in it. Elite people, people with money, tend to experience more parts of the world that have money than the other parts of the world, and that's not an accident. So in the time that remains, I want to just talk a little bit about what I think we should do instead. This alternative I discussed at the beginning, a constructive approach to putting standpoint epistemology into practice. I think a constructive approach to putting standpoint epistemology into practice would focus on specific pursuit of specific goals and end results, rather than sort of more moralizing goals of avoiding complicity or injustice or adhering to moral principles about making one's rooms look a certain way, about consuming media in a certain way. I think it would be concerned about building institutions and cultivating practices of information gathering and institutions of information gathering rather than another approach. It would focus on accountability rather than conformity, so on and so forth. In other words, it would focus on the sorts of things that determine which interactions we have rather than how to manage the interactions that we have, which have already inherited the distortions from the world itself rather than our approach to the world itself. And all of that sounds abstract, and all of that is abstract. So to give a sort of concrete exemplification of what I'm talking about, I think it's instructive to think about the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, and the way that the residents of Flint responded to it. The Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, a government body with 50 trained scientists at its disposal, was complicit in covering up the scale and gravity of the water crisis from the initial switch of water supply in 2014 until the crisis garnered national attention in 2015. The way that the residents of Flint responded was by taking some epistemic authority and epistemic power from people who had it and building with them by creating a new room. There was no institution that existed to give them access to this, but they were able to find collaboration opportunities with scientists who had laboratories, who had resources that they could use. They built a new room that put them into collaboration. So once they recruited the scientists to their cause, the Flint residents led a citizen science campaign. They further raised the alarm about water quality. They distributed sample kits to neighbors to submit for testing. And this alliance of people in a room that would have been much different at a hospital at Virginia Tech University, and people far away in the city of Flint, Michigan, they created a new room where they were collaborating with each other, sharing resources, sharing knowledge, and pursuing a joint project of winning health justice for the people of Flint. And that was a sort of success, and they won changes to the pipes. They even won a multi-million-dollar settlement payout. They won some things. And I think we should be under no illusions. They didn't utterly change everything that was wrong about society. But nevertheless, I think there's more to learn from that sort of example than other sorts of examples. The biggest threat to social justice isn't, in my view, the absence of more jargon or the right kinds of spokespeople to describe the epistemic, attentional, or interpersonal afflictions of people who are disempowered. The biggest threat to social justice is the disempowerment itself. Our response should be of the same kind. We should not be focused primarily on how we manage the interactions that we have. We should be focusing more centrally on what interactions we have in the first place, what power and potential that we build behind them, what scaffolding we build under them so that those interactions can be powerful, and what power we build by means of them, like the citizen science collaboration of the scientists with the residents of Flint, Michigan. From that perspective, I think the biggest threats to social justice in a more specific sense are the erosion of the practical and material bases for popular power over and influence over knowledge production, and the fact that these are increasingly being captured and corrupted by elites, especially large corporations and state governments, especially tech corporations. The corporate monopolization of local news, the destruction and on with the destruction and looting of the entire profession of journalism. The interference of corporations and governments in key democratic processes, especially elections, and advertising, and the domination of elite interests in the production of knowledge in the first place, as done by research universities, for example, as well as the circulation of the output of all of these distorted processes by established media organizations that have, as I mentioned at the beginning, looted local news and other forms of local knowledge production. These are the things that we have to challenge if we believe in standpoint epistemology. These are things that challenge the mechanisms by which marginalized people would be heard. And if we want to challenge those, it's not conversational etiquette we need to challenge, it's institutions and elite power structures. Confronting these threats would require leaving the room entirely and building new ones. So I challenge you all to do that today. Thank you for your time.